In the heart of the American West lies a land forged by fire and ice, carved by ancient rivers, and transformed forever by one glittering element: gold. This is Idaho, a name that would come to symbolize the dreams, desperation, and determination of thousands who ventured into its unforgiving wilderness in search of fortune. But the story of Idaho is far more than a tale of precious metals and overnight millionaires. It is a saga of survival against impossible odds, of communities rising from nothing in the shadow of snow-capped peaks, and of a diverse tapestry of people: Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, freed slaves, European pioneers, and outlaws alike, whose lives intertwined in ways that would shape the American frontier forever. Today, we journey back in time to an era when fortunes were made and lost in the span of a season, when justice came from the barrel of a gun, and when the promise of gold fever could transform a peaceful valley into a roaring boomtown virtually overnight. This is the true story of old Idaho, where every nugget of gold carried the weight of dreams, and every frontier settlement told a tale of human ambition at its most raw and remarkable. From the sacred lands of the Nez Perce and Shoshone peoples to the lawless streets of Idaho City, from the treacherous mountain passes where prospectors met their fate to the ghost towns that still whisper their secrets to the wind. Join us as we uncover the extraordinary history of a place that helped define the American spirit of adventure, perseverance, and the eternal quest for a better life. Long before the first prospector's pickaxe struck stone in Idaho's mountains, these lands belonged to peoples who had called them home for more than 14,000 years. The region that would become Idaho was not empty wilderness, waiting to be discovered. It was a homeland, rich with tradition, spirituality, and sophisticated societies that had mastered the art of living in harmony with this dramatic landscape. The Nez Perce, or Nimipu as they called themselves, meaning the people, inhabited the valleys and plateaus of north-central Idaho. They were renowned horsemen and skilled fishermen who had developed an intimate understanding of the region's salmon runs. Their territory encompassed some of the most breathtaking landscapes in North America, from the deep canyons of the Clearwater River to the rolling prairies of the Camas. To the south, the Shoshone and Bannock peoples roamed the high desert plains and mountain ranges. These were nomadic hunters who followed the seasonal migrations of buffalo and other game across vast territories. The Shoshone, in particular, had developed extensive trade networks that stretched from the Pacific coast to the Great Plains, exchanging salmon, obsidian, and other goods with tribes hundreds of miles away. The Coeur d'Alene people, whose name means heart of Y'all in French, a reference to their sharp trading skills, occupied the lake region of northern Idaho. They were master canoe builders and fishermen who had developed sustainable practices for harvesting the abundant resources of their territory for countless generations. The first Americans of European descent to enter Idaho were members of the legendary Lewis and Clark expedition in 1805. After crossing the treacherous Bitterroot Mountains, a journey so difficult that the explorers were reduced to eating their horses and candles to survive, they emerged into Nez Perce territory, starving and exhausted. It was the Nez Perce who saved them. A woman named Wakuwais, who had been captured by another tribe years earlier and treated kindly by white traders before escaping, urged her people to welcome these strange visitors. The Nez Perce provided food, shelter, and guidance, helping the expedition build canoes and navigate the Clearwater River toward the Pacific Ocean. This act of generosity would have profound and ultimately tragic consequences. The expedition's journals described a land of incredible natural wealth, pristine rivers teeming with salmon, forests of towering pines, and mountains that seemed to touch the sky. Word of this paradise spread, and it was only a matter of time before others would follow. In the decades following Lewis and Clark, a new breed of adventurer emerged in the Rocky Mountain West: the mountain man. These were trappers and traders who ventured into the wilderness for months or even years at a time, pursuing the valuable pelts of beaver, whose fur was in high demand for fashionable hats in Europe and the eastern United States. Idaho became a crucial hub in the fur trade. The region's rivers and streams were home to vast populations of beaver, and trading posts soon dotted the landscape. Fort Hall, established in 1834 on the Snake River Plain, became one of the most important outposts in the American West, a place where trappers could trade their pelts, resupply, and exchange stories of their adventures in the wild. The mountain men who worked these lands were legendary figures. Men like Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, and Jedediah Smith became icons of frontier independence, individuals who could survive in the harshest conditions, navigate by the stars, and communicate with a dozen different Native American tribes. They lived on the edge of civilization, often adopting native customs, marrying native women, and serving as the first bridges between two vastly different worlds. But the fur trade era was already waning by the 1840s. Changing fashions in Europe reduced demand for beaver pelts, and the relentless trapping had depleted beaver populations across the West. Many mountain men turned to guiding immigrant wagon trains along the Oregon Trail, which passed directly through southern Idaho. They traded their trap lines for trail wisdom, leading thousands of settlers through the region on their way to Oregon and California. For most of these immigrants, Idaho was merely a place to pass through, a challenging obstacle on the road to somewhere else. The desert plains were harsh and unforgiving, water was scarce, and the mountains seemed impenetrable. Few imagined that they were walking over ground that concealed one of the richest treasure troves in American history. The year was 1860, and California's gold fields were beginning to play out. Thousands of prospectors who had rushed west in 1849 now found themselves scratching for ever diminishing returns. These men had tasted the intoxicating possibility of instant wealth, and they weren't ready to give up the dream. They began spreading out across the West, following every rumor, testing every stream, climbing every mountain in search of the next big strike. In the summer of 1860, a prospecting party led by Elias Davidson Pierce ventured into the rugged Clearwater country of northern Idaho. Nez Perce territory. Pierce was a veteran of the California Gold Rush, a man who had spent years chasing color across the mountains. On a small tributary of the Clearwater River called Orofino Creek, he and his companions made a discovery that would change Idaho forever. Gold. Not just traces, but substantial deposits of placer gold, the kind you could scoop from the creek bed with a simple pan. Pierce tried to keep the discovery secret, but word of gold has the way of spreading like wildfire. By the spring of 1861, thousands of prospectors were streaming into the region, and the Idaho gold rush had begun. The Clearwater strikes were just the beginning. In 1862, a party of prospectors discovered gold in the Boise Basin, in the mountains northeast of present-day Boise. This discovery would prove to be one of the richest placer gold deposits in American history, producing more gold than any other mining district in the Pacific Northwest. Within months, the Boise Basin was transformed from pristine wilderness into a frenzied landscape of mining camps. Towns sprang up almost overnight: Idaho City, Placerville, Centerville, Pioneerville, their populations swelling into the thousands as fortune seekers poured in from every direction. By 1863, Idaho City had become the largest city in the Pacific Northwest, with a population exceeding that of Portland, Oregon. The gold was remarkably accessible. Unlike the hard rock mining that would dominate later strikes, the Boise Basin gold could be extracted using simple placer methods: panning, sluicing, and basic hydraulic techniques. A man with nothing more than a pick, a shovel, and a pan could potentially become wealthy in a single season. This accessibility drew not only experienced miners, but farmers, clerks, teachers, and adventurers from all walks of life. While the Boise Basin was producing gold, another major strike was developing in the remote Oahe Mountains of southwestern Idaho. Here, prospectors discovered not only gold but rich veins of silver ore. Unlike the placer deposits of the Boise Basin, the Oahe ores were locked in hard rock, requiring more sophisticated mining techniques and substantial capital investment. Silver City, founded in 1864, became the center of this new mining district. The town grew rapidly, attracting investors and engineers from as far away as San Francisco and New York. Massive stamp mills were constructed to crush the ore, and underground mines burrowed deep into the mountains, following veins of silver and gold that seemed to extend endlessly into the earth. The Oahe mines produced millions of dollars in precious metals during their peak years. Unlike the Boise Basin, where individual prospectors could stake claims and work them with hand tools, Silver City was dominated by large mining companies with the capital to purchase expensive equipment and hire workers. This represented a fundamental shift in the nature of Western mining from the democratic free for all of the early gold rushes to an increasingly industrial enterprise. The mining camps of Idaho were unlike anything most of their inhabitants had ever experienced. These were instant cities, erupting from the wilderness in a matter of weeks, populated by a volatile mix of desperate dreamers, Hardened criminals, shrewd businessmen, and ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. In the early days, there was no law, no government, no established order of any kind. Miners created their own rules through impromptu meetings, establishing mining districts with elected recorders to track claims and settle disputes. Justice was often rough and immediate. A thief caught stealing from a sluice box might find himself dangling from a tree by sunset. The streets of Idaho City during its boom years were a sensory assault. Mud or dust, depending on the season, churned beneath the boots of thousands of men rushing between claims, saloons, and supply stores. The sound of pickaxes, the roar of sluice boxes, and the constant murmur of commerce filled the air. Mule trains carried supplies over treacherous mountain trails, while express riders raced through town with news from distant cities. While prospectors chased gold in the creeks, another kind of fortune was being made in town. Merchants, hotel keepers, saloon owners, and service providers of every description discovered that the real money often lay not in mining but in mining the miners. Prices for basic goods were astronomical. A simple meal might cost several dollars, a fortune by the standards of the day. The phrase "seeing the elephant" became common parlance among gold rush participants, referring to the experience of confronting the harsh realities of frontier life. Many who arrived expecting to scoop gold from streams found instead backbreaking labor, financial ruin, and the crushing disappointment of watching others strike it rich while they found nothing. Yet the boomtowns also developed surprising sophistication. Within a few years of their founding, Idaho City and other mining towns boasted newspapers, theaters, churches, schools, and fraternal organizations. The miners might be rough around the edges, but many brought education and culture from their former lives. Shakespearean plays were performed in makeshift theaters, and debates on politics and philosophy filled the saloons alongside card games and drinking. In the early mining camps, women were rare, perhaps one for every 100 men. Those who did venture into these rough settlements found themselves in a unique position. Married women ran boarding houses and laundries, earning far more than their husbands could make in the goldfields. Single women faced both extraordinary opportunities and significant dangers. Some women made fortunes. Polybemis, a Chinese woman sold into servitude, eventually won her freedom in a poker game and went on to become a respected figure in the Warren mining district. Other women worked as dance hall performers, entertainers, or in the sex trade that inevitably accompanied the mining camps. Regardless of their occupation, women in the goldfields navigated a world that was both liberating and perilous. As towns matured, more families arrived. Schools were established, churches constructed, and the wild excesses of the early camps gradually gave way to something resembling civilized society. Women were often at the forefront of these civilizing efforts, organizing temperance movements, literary societies, and charitable organizations that helped transform mining camps into genuine communities. Among the most significant populations in Idaho's mining districts were Chinese immigrants. By the 1870s, Chinese miners numbered in the thousands across Idaho, representing one of the largest ethnic groups in the territory. They had been drawn to America by the same golden dreams that motivated everyone else, but their experience would be marked by discrimination, violence, and remarkable perseverance. Most Chinese miners arrived in Idaho after working the declining gold fields of California. As white miners moved on to fresh strikes, Chinese workers moved in to work claims that had been abandoned as unprofitable. Through patience, skill, and incredibly hard work, they often managed to extract gold that others had missed. They developed techniques for reworking tailings and recovering fine gold that white miners had discarded. Chinese communities established their own neighborhoods and mining towns, complete with temples, stores, and gathering places. They maintained their cultural traditions while adapting to frontier life, celebrating traditional festivals and observing ancestral customs thousands of miles from their homeland. The Chinese miners sent much of their earnings back to families in China, contributing to a vast flow of gold and silver across the Pacific. But life was dangerous for Chinese immigrants. They faced systematic discrimination, violence, and eventually exclusionary laws designed to drive them from the territory. In 1887, one of the worst massacres in American history took place at Deep Creek in Hell's Canyon, where a gang of horse thieves murdered at least 34 Chinese miners and stole their gold. Most of the perpetrators were never brought to justice. Despite such horrors, the Chinese contribution to Idaho's development was immense and lasting. The gold rush also brought African Americans to Idaho, both free men seeking their fortunes and formerly enslaved people who had escaped or been freed during the Civil War. While their numbers were smaller than the Chinese population, Black pioneers left an indelible mark on the territory. Some achieved remarkable success. O.B. Goodall became one of the most prosperous businessmen in Silver City, operating a barbershop that served the town's elite. Black women worked as laundresses and cooks, occupations that were among the most lucrative available in the mining camps, despite facing racism and discrimination. African Americans carved out spaces for themselves in Idaho's frontier society, establishing families and businesses that would endure for generations. For Idaho's native peoples, the gold rush was catastrophic. The influx of thousands of miners into their traditional territories disrupted hunting grounds, polluted streams, and brought diseases that devastated tribal populations. Treaties signed with the federal government were routinely violated as miners flooded onto native lands in pursuit of gold. The Nez Perce, who had welcomed Lewis and Clark 60 years earlier, watched helplessly as their homeland was overrun. Despite promises of protected reservations, gold discoveries repeatedly led to demands that treaty boundaries be redrawn. The pressure would eventually lead to the tragic Nez Perce War of 1877 when Chief Joseph led his people on a desperate flight toward Canada, fighting a running battle against the U.S. Army across 1,200 miles of wilderness. The Shoshone and Bannock peoples faced similar pressures. Conflicts between settlers and native peoples erupted into violence throughout the 1860s and 1870s. The Bear River Massacre of 1863, just across the Idaho border in present-day Utah, saw Colonel Patrick Connor's California Volunteers kill an estimated 250 Shoshone men, women, and children, one of the deadliest attacks on Native Americans in U.S. history. Where gold flowed, outlaws followed. Idaho's mountain passes and lonely trails became hunting grounds for road agents, bandits who preyed on gold shipments, stagecoaches, and individual travelers. The remote wilderness provided perfect cover for ambushes, and the lack of organized law enforcement meant that criminals often operated with impunity. The most notorious of these desperados operated along the routes connecting Idaho's mining camps to the outside world. Stagecoaches carrying gold dust and bullion were particularly tempting targets. Express companies offered rewards for the capture of road agents, but the criminals were often locals who knew the country intimately and had networks of informants in the mining towns. The Plummer Gang, led by the charismatic Henry Plummer, terrorized the mining regions of present-day Montana and eastern Idaho. Plummer had the audacity to get himself elected sheriff of Bannock while simultaneously leading a band of road agents who were robbing and murdering miners throughout the region. His dual life was eventually discovered, and in 1864 he was hanged by vigilantes. In the absence of formal law enforcement, miners took justice into their own hands. Vigilance committees formed in nearly every mining district, tribunals of local men who held impromptu trials and carried out sentences that ranged from banishment to hanging. The line between justice and mob violence was often razor thin. The vigilante movement reached its peak in the mid-1860s in Idaho City alone. At least 5 men were hanged by vigilantes in 1865. The executions were public affairs, drawing crowds of spectators who watched as condemned men were marched to makeshift gallows. Whether these hangings represented justice or murder remains debated to this day. As Idaho Territory established formal government and courts, vigilante justice gradually declined. Professional lawmen replaced miners' tribunals, and the rule of law, however imperfect, began to take hold. But the vigilante tradition left a complex legacy, one that celebrated rough frontier justice while also acknowledging its potential for abuse and the targeting of marginalized communities, particularly Chinese and Native American populations. Idaho became an official U.S. territory in 1863, and with territorial status came the apparatus of government. Judges, marshals, and prosecutors arrived to establish courts and enforce federal law. The transition was neither smooth nor immediate. Many miners resented outside interference in their affairs, and local customs often conflicted with territorial regulations. The first territorial capital was established at Lewiston, near the original gold strike at Orofino Creek. Political maneuvering soon moved the capital south to Boise, a decision that reflected the shift in population and economic power toward the southern mining districts. The struggle over the capital's location would continue for years, reflecting deeper divisions between northern and southern Idaho that persist in some form to this day. A miner's life in Idaho was one of grueling physical labor. Days began before dawn and ended after dark, with hours spent standing in icy streams, swinging pickaxes, and shoveling gravel. The work was backbreaking, monotonous, and often unrewarding. For every miner who struck it rich, dozens more barely broke even or lost everything. Placer mining, the most common method in Idaho's gold districts, involved washing gold bearing gravel to separate the heavy gold particles from lighter sand and rock. Simple panning was slow and inefficient. Most miners used sluice boxes, long wooden troughs fitted with riffles that caught the gold as water and gravel flowed through. Building and maintaining these sluices required constant work. Living conditions in the mining camps were primitive. Miners slept in canvas tents, rough cabins, or dugouts carved into hillsides. Meals consisted of beans, bacon, and sourdough bread, day after day, week after week.
Fresh vegetables and fruit were rare luxuries. Scurvy was a genuine concern in camps far from agricultural settlements.
When the workday ended, miners sought entertainment and release. Saloons were the social centers of every mining town, places where men could drink, gamble, and forget the hardships of their daily existence. Gambling was ubiquitous. Poker, faro, and Monte games ran around the clock, and fortunes won in the gold fields were lost across card tables. Theaters and dance halls provided more refined entertainment. Touring performers made regular circuits through the mining towns, presenting everything from Shakespearean drama to minstrel shows. Dance halls employed women, hurdy-gurdy girls, to dance with lonely miners for a fee. These establishments operated in moral gray zones, and reformers frequently campaigned to shut them down. Religion also played a role in frontier life. Itinerant preachers brought the gospel to the gold fields, holding services in saloons, tents, or open fields. Catholic priests ministered to Irish and Mexican miners, while Protestant denominations competed for souls among the Anglo population. Churches represented stability and civilization, a reminder of the world the miners had left behind and hoped to rejoin. Despite their remote locations, Idaho's mining camps maintained surprisingly robust connections to the outside world. Stage lines carried passengers and mail across the mountains, linking isolated towns to Salt Lake City, Portland, and San Francisco. The arrival of the mail coach was an event eagerly anticipated. Letters from home were treasured, and newspapers from distant cities were passed from hand to hand until they fell apart. Telegraph lines reached Idaho City in 1864, connecting the mining capital to the National Communications Network. News that once took weeks to arrive could now be transmitted in minutes. Miners followed the progress of the Civil War through telegraphic dispatches, cheering Union victories and debating the politics of Reconstruction. The world beyond the mountains suddenly felt closer than ever before. Nothing lasts forever in a mining town. The same forces that created Idaho's boom towns. The presence of accessible gold guaranteed their eventual decline. As the easy placer deposits were exhausted, populations began to drift away, seeking new strikes in Montana, Colorado, or Alaska. The once bustling streets grew quiet, and buildings that had housed thousands stood empty and decaying. Idaho City, which had boasted a population of over 6,000 at its peak, shrank to a few hundred permanent residents by the 1870s. The surrounding camps of Placerville, Pioneerville, and Centerville faded even faster. Fire, a constant threat in towns built of wood and canvas, swept through many communities, destroying in hours what had taken years to build. Some towns rebuilt, others simply disappeared. Silver City hung on longer, sustained by its hard rock mines and the capital invested in them. But even there, declining ore grades and falling silver prices eventually took their toll. By the turn of the 20th century, Silver City was a shadow of its former self, a collection of sagging buildings and memories, slowly being reclaimed by the mountains. Today, Idaho's ghost towns stand as monuments to the gold rush era. Silver City remains one of the best preserved mining towns in the American West, its buildings protected by a dedicated preservation society and the dry mountain air that has slowed decay. Visitors can walk streets that once echoed with the boots of miners and the wheels of ore wagons. In the Boise Basin, traces of the mining era remain scattered across the landscape. Abandoned mine shafts, collapsed cabins, and rusting equipment dot the hillsides. The forest has reclaimed much of what the miners built, but careful observers can still find evidence of the frenetic activity that once transformed this wilderness. The Chinese communities left their own archaeological legacy. Excavations at sites throughout Idaho have uncovered artifacts that illuminate the daily lives of these immigrant workers, ceramic rice bowls, medicine bottles, coins, and gaming pieces that speak to a vibrant culture maintained thousands of miles from home. These finds have helped historians reconstruct a chapter of Idaho history that was long overlooked or deliberately erased. Even as the mining industry declined, Idaho was transforming. The miners had proven that people could live and work in this remote region, and entrepreneurs began to see other opportunities. Ranchers drove cattle into the mountain meadows and desert valleys. Farmers experimented with irrigation, discovering that the volcanic soil of the Snake River Plain could produce abundant crops when properly watered. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 changed everything. While Idaho itself lacked direct rail connections for years, the railroad transformed the economics of the entire West. Goods that once required months of overland travel could now reach markets in weeks. Idaho's cattle could be shipped to eastern markets, and manufactured goods from the industrial east became readily available. Rail lines eventually reached Idaho in the 1880s. The Oregon Short Line crossed the southern part of the territory, connecting Boise and other towns to the national network. The railroad brought new settlers, not gold seekers, but farmers, merchants, and families looking to build permanent lives on the frontier. Towns that had languished in isolation now found themselves connected to the broader American economy. On July 3rd, 1890, Idaho became the 43rd state admitted to the Union. The territory that had been carved from the wilderness just 30 years earlier had grown into a functioning society with farms, ranches, towns, and a permanent population committed to building a future in this challenging land. Statehood represented a coming of age, the recognition that Idaho was no longer a temporary camp for gold seekers, but a permanent part of the American nation. The state's first constitution reflected the values and concerns of its citizens, including provisions for public education, agricultural development, and the protection of water rights that would be essential for irrigation. The mining industry continued to play a role in Idaho's economy, though it was no longer dominant. New discoveries in the Coeur d'Alene district of northern Idaho brought another boom in silver and lead mining, one that would make the region one of the most productive mining districts in world history. But the state's future lay increasingly in agriculture, timber, and other industries that promised stability rather than quick riches. The gold rush left an indelible mark on Idaho. The prospectors and miners who flooded into the territory in the 1860s established the patterns of settlement that still define the state today. Boise, which began as a supply center for the mining districts, grew into the state capital and largest city. Towns throughout the mountains traced their origins to the frantic search for gold and silver. The environmental impact of mining shaped Idaho's landscape in ways that remain visible. Rivers were diverted, hillsides scarred, and forests cleared to fuel stamp mills and build sluices. Mercury and other toxic materials used in gold processing contaminated waterways that are still being cleaned up today. The gold rush was not just a human drama, but an ecological transformation. The diverse populations drawn to Idaho's gold fields contributed to a multicultural heritage that is too often overlooked. Chinese, African American, Hispanic, and European immigrants all played roles in building the state, even as they faced discrimination and hardship. Their stories are increasingly being recovered and celebrated, adding depth and complexity to our understanding of frontier history. For Native peoples, the gold rush was catastrophic, a disaster that disrupted ancient ways of life and led to dispossession, violence, and cultural destruction. The Nez Perce, Shoshone, Bannock, and Coeur d'Alene peoples survived despite enormous pressures, maintaining their identities and traditions through generations of adversity. Today, their nations continue to assert their sovereignty and preserve their cultural heritage. What can we learn from Idaho's gold rush era? Perhaps the most enduring lesson is about the nature of human ambition itself. The men and women who flocked to Idaho's gold fields were driven by dreams of wealth and independence, the same dreams that have motivated human beings throughout history. Some achieved their goals, most did not, but all of them participated in a great human adventure, one that tested the limits of endurance and the bonds of community. The gold rush also reminds us that history is complicated. The same era that produced remarkable stories of courage and success also witnessed terrible injustices. Chinese miners were murdered for their gold, Native peoples were driven from their lands, the environment was exploited without thought for future generations. These darker chapters cannot be separated from the more romantic narratives of frontier adventure. Finally, the gold rush era demonstrates the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and community building. In the most unlikely circumstances, in remote mountain valleys, far from established institutions, people created societies, established rules, and built communities. They argued about justice, debated politics, and struggled to create order out of chaos. This impulse to build, to connect, to create something larger than oneself may be the most important legacy of all. As the sun sets over Idaho's mountains today, casting long shadows across valleys where miners once labored, it's easy to feel the presence of the past. The creeks still flow, carrying traces of the gold that transformed this land. The mountains still stand, keeping their secrets as they have for millennia. And somewhere in an old mining town or a lonely canyon, the ghosts of the gold rush still seem to linger. The story of gold fever and frontier life in Idaho is, at its heart, a story about what drives human beings to take extraordinary risks in pursuit of their dreams. The prospectors who climbed these mountains in the 1860s were not so different from entrepreneurs, artists, and adventurers today. People willing to bet everything on the chance of striking it rich, whatever rich might mean to them. The gold is mostly gone now, washed from the creeks and extracted from the mountains long ago. But Idaho's true treasure was never really the metal itself. It was the human stories, the triumphs and tragedies, the courage and the cruelty, the building and the breaking that unfolded in these wild places. These stories belong to all of us, part of the complex tapestry of American history. Next time you travel through Idaho, whether crossing the desert on Interstate 84 or winding through the mountains on a backcountry road, take a moment to remember the people who came before. Remember the Nez Perce and Shoshone who called this land home for countless generations. Remember the miners who risked everything on a dream of gold. Remember the Chinese workers who endured discrimination while helping to build a new society. Remember the women, the outlaws, the merchants, and the dreamers who all played their parts in this remarkable chapter of history. Their stories echo still in the mountains and canyons of Idaho. And now, having heard this tale, you carry their stories with you too.